Hello and welcome. It is going to be a long one today, folks. I will tell you why. Well, depending on how tired my throat and my voice is, it will be a semi-long one, probably 3 hours. It will be long because tomorrow is election day. And I just don't feel really, up for reading tomorrow. Because I'm going to be worrying about more important things. For those of you that are outside of the United States, we are going to elect either the current president or a new president. I will try to show no bias, but I want a new president. But who knows? Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? So yeah, I'm going to be more concentrated on that, as I should be. For those of you, please vote. Vote, vote, vote. 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 Yeah. This is going to be a big one. Alrighty. Sorry if I'm not trying to say more about my political views, but I don't know. I don't support this president at all, and I just want a new one. Yeah. All right. Well, let's get started. Okay. So, sorry, I just have to adjust my things. So where was I? Oh yeah, I was right here. So let me see how much I want to read tonight. How much I can read tonight. Alright. Sorry. I was just trying to figure out where I was going to read tonight. So last we left off, also, I'm going to be drinking tonight because I can and I want to. Hopefully I will read just fine. I'm pretty sure I will, because last time I did when I was drinking. It was good. So yeah. Last time we left off, Chio Chan went with Mr. Tanaka and his family to go spend the night over there and, you know, see how things would be better off if she moved. Because her dad is old and her mom is dying. Alright, so we are on to chapter 3. So, chapter 3. Back at home. Excuse me. Yeah, chapter 3. Back at home, my mother seemed to have grown sicker in the day I'd been away. Or perhaps it was just that I'd managed to forget how ill she really was. Mr. Tanaka's house had smelled of smoke and pine, but ours smelled of her illness in a way I can't even bear to describe. Setsu was working in the village during the afternoon, so Mrs. Sugi came to help me bathe my mother. When we carried her out of the house, her rib cage was broader than her shoulders, and even the white of her eyes were cloudy. I could only endure seeing her this way by remembering how I'd once felt stepping out of the bath with her while she was strong and healthy, when the steam had risen from our pale skin as if we were 2 pieces of boiled radish. I found it hard to imagine that this woman, whose back I had so often scraped with a stone, and whose flesh had always seemed firmer and smoother to me than Setsu's, might be dead before even the end of summer. That night, while lying on my futon, I tried to picture the whole confusing situation from every angle to persuade myself that things would somehow be all right. To begin with, I wondered how could we go on living without my mother? Even if we did survive and Mr. Tanaka adopted us, would my own family cease to exist? Finally, I decided Mr. Tanaka wouldn't adopt just my sister and me, but my father as well. He couldn't accept my father to live alone after all. He couldn't accept my father to live alone after all. Usually, I couldn't fall asleep until I managed to convince myself this was true, with the result that I didn't sleep much during those weeks, and excuse me, sorry. Yeah, usually I couldn't fall asleep until I managed to convince myself this was true, with the result that I didn't sleep much during those weeks, and mornings were a blur. On one of these mornings during the heat of the summer, I was on my way back from fetching a packet of tea in the village when I heard a crunching noise behind me. It turned out to be Mr. Sugi, Mr. Tanaka's assistant, running up the path. When he reached me, he took a long while to catch his breath, huffing and holding his side as if he'd run all the way from Senzuru. He was red and shiny like a snapper, though the day hadn't grown hot yet. Finally, he said, "Mr. Tanaka wants you and your sister to come down to the village as soon as you can." I thought it odd that my father hadn't gone out fishing that morning. Now I knew why. Today was the day. "And my father?" I asked. "Did Mr. Tanaka say anything about him?" "Just get along, Chio-chan," he told me. "Go and fetch your sister." I didn't like this, but I ran up to the house and found my father sitting at the table, digging grime out of the rut in the wood with one of his fingernails. Setsu was putting slivers of charcoal into the stove, which seemed as though the two of them were waiting for something horrible to happen. I said, "Father, Mr. Tanaka wants Setsu and me to go down to the village." Setsu took off her apron, hung it on a peg, and walked out the door. My father didn't answer. My father didn't answer, but blinked a few times, staring at the point where Setsu had been. Then he turned his eyes heavily toward the floor and gave a nod. I heard my mother cry out in her sleep from the back room. Setsu was almost to the village before I caught up with her. I had imagined this day for weeks already, but I'd never expected to feel as frightened as I did. Setsu didn't seem to realize this trip to the village was any different from the one she might have made the day before. She hadn't even bothered to clean the charcoal off her hands. While wiping her hair away, she ended up with a smudge on her face. I didn't want her to meet Mr. Tanaka in this condition, so I reached up to rub off the mark, just as her mother might have done. Setsu knocked my hand away. Outside the Japan Coastal Seafood Company, I bowed and said good morning to Mr. Tanaka, expecting he would be happy to see us. Instead, he was strangely cold. I suppose this should have been my first clue that things weren't going to happen just the way I'd imagined. When he led us to his horse-drawn wagon, I decided he probably wanted to drive us to his house so that his wife and daughter would be in the room when he told us about our adoption. Mr. Sugi will be riding in front with me, he said. So you and Shizu-chan had better get into the back. That's just what he said. Shizu-san. I thought it very rude of him to get my sister's name wrong that way, but she didn't seem to notice. She climbed into the back of the wagon and sat down among the empty fish baskets, putting one on her hands flat. I thought it very rude of him to get my sister's name wrong that way, but she didn't seem to notice. She climbed into the back of the wagon. My pajama top is moving and I don't like it. There we go. She climbed into the back of the wagon and sat down among the empty fish baskets, putting one of her hands flat on the slimy planks. Then, with the same hand, she wiped a fly from her face, leaving a shiny patch on her cheek. I didn't feel as indifferently about the slime as Setsu did. I couldn't think about anything but the smell, and about how satisfied I would be to wash my hands, and perhaps even my clothes when we reached Mr. Tanaka's house. During the trip, Setsu and I didn't speak a word until we topped the hill overlooking Senzuru, when all of a sudden she said, "A train." Yeah, a train. I looked out to see a train in the distance, making its way toward the town. The smoke rolled downwind in a way that made me think of the skin being shed from a snake. I thought this was clever and tried explaining it to Setsu, but she didn't seem to care. Mr. Tanaka would have appreciated it, I thought, and so would Kuniko. I decided to explain it to both of them when we reached the Tanaka's home. Then suddenly I realized we weren't headed in the direction of Mr. Tanaka's home at all. The wagon came to a stop a few minutes later on a patch of dirt beside the train tracks, just outside the town. A crowd of people stood with sacks and crates piled around them, and there, to one side of them, was Mrs. Fidget, standing beside a peculiarly let me say that again. And there, to one side of them, was Mrs. Fidget, standing beside a peculiarly narrow man wearing a stiff kimono. He had soft black hair, like a cat's, and and held in one of his hands a cloth bag suspended from a string. He struck me as out of place in Sanzuru, particularly there beside the farmers and the fishermen with their crates, and an old hunt and a and an old hunched woman wearing a rucksack of yams. Mrs. Fidget said something to him, and when he turned and peered at us, I decided at once that I was frightened of him. Let me just put some chapstick on. Mr. Tanaka introduced us to this man, whose name was Beku. Mr. Beku said nothing at all, but only looked closely at me and seemed puzzled by Satsu. Mr. Tanaka said to him, "I brought Sugi with me from Yoroido. Would you like him to accompany you? He knows the girls, and I can spare him for a day or so." "No, no," said Mr. Beku, waving his hand. I certainly hadn't expected any of this. I asked where we were going, but no one seemed to hear me, so I came up with an answer for myself. I decided Mr. Tanaka had been displeased with what Mrs. Fidget had told him about us, and that this curiously narrow man, Mr. Beku, planned to take us somewhere to have our fortunes told more completely. Afterward, we would be returned to Mr. Tanaka. While I tried my best to soothe myself with these thoughts, Mrs. Fidget, wearing a pleasant smile, led Setsu and me from distance down the dirt platform. When we were too far away for the others to hear us, her smile vanished and she said, "Now listen to me. You're both naughty girls." She looked around to be sure no one was watching and then hit us on the tops of our heads. She didn't hurt me, but I cried out in surprise. "If you do something to embarrass me," she went on, "I'll make you pay for it. Mr. Beku is a stern man. You must pay attention to what he says. If he tells you to crawl under the seat of a train, you'll do it. Understand?" From the expression on Mrs. Fidget's face, I knew I should answer her or she might hurt me. But I was in such shock I couldn't speak. And then, just as I'd feared, she reached out and began pinching me so hard on the side of my cheek that I couldn't even tell which part of me hurt. I felt as if I'd fallen into the tub of creatures that were biting me. Yeah, I felt as if I'd fallen into a tub of creatures that were biting me everywhere. And I heard myself whimper. The next thing I knew, Mr. Tanaka was standing beside us. "What's going on here?" he said. "If you have something more to say to these girls, say it while I'm standing here. There's no cause for you to treat them this way." "I'm sure we have a great many more things to talk about, but the train is coming," Mrs. Fidget said, and it was true. I could see it curling around a turn not far in the distance. Mr. Tanaka led us back up the platforms to where the farmers and old women were gathering up their things. Soon the train came to a stop before us. Mr. Beku, in his stiff kimono, wedged himself between Setsu and me and led us far by our elbows into the train car. I heard Mr. Tanaka say something, but I was too confused and upset to understand it. I couldn't trust what I heard, but it might have been, "Mata yo, we'll meet again," or this, "Mate yo, wait," or even this, "Ma de yo, well, let's go." When I peered out the window, I saw Mr. Tanaka walking back toward his cart, and Mrs. Fidget wiping her hands all over her kimono. After a moment, my sister said, "Chiyo-chan!" I buried my face in my hands, and honestly, I would have plunged in anguish through the floor of the train if I could, because the way my sister said my name, she hardly needed to say anything more. "Do you know where we're going?" she said to me. I think all she wanted was a yes or no answer. Probably it didn't matter to her what our destination was, so long as someone knew what was happening. But, of course, I didn't. I asked the narrow man, Mr. Beku, but he paid me no attention. He was still staring at Setsu as if he had never seen anything like her before. Finally, he squeezed his face into a look of disgust and said, "Fish! What a stench, the both of you!" He took a comb from his drawstring bag and began tearing it through her hair. I'm certain he must have hurt her, but I could see that watching the countryside pass by outside the window hurt her even more. In a moment, Setsu's lips turned down like a baby's and she began to cry. Even if she'd hit me and yelled at me, I wouldn't have ached as much as I did watching her whole face tremble. Everything was my fault. An old peasant woman with her teeth bared like a dog came over with a carrot for Setsu, and after giving it to her, asked where she was going. "Kyoto," Mr. Beku answered. I felt so sick with worry hearing this. I couldn't bring myself to look at Setsu in the eye any longer. Even the town of Senzudo seemed a remote, faraway place. As for Kyoto, it sounded as foreign to me as Hong Kong or even New York, which I had once heard Dr. Miura talk about. For all I knew, they ground up children in Kyoto and fed them to dogs. We were on that train for many hours, without food to eat. The sight of Mr. Beku taking a wrapped up lotus leaf from his bag and unwrapped it to reveal a rice ball sprinkled with sesame seeds certainly got my attention. But when he took it in his bony fingers and pressed it into his mean little mouth without so much as looking at me, I felt as if I couldn't take another moment of torment. We got off the train at last in a large town, which I took to be Kyoto, but after a time another train pulled into the station, and we boarded it. This one did take us to Kyoto. It was much more crowded than the first train had been, so we had to stand. By the time we arrived, as evening was approaching, I felt as sore as a rock must feel when the waterfall had pounded on it all day long. I could see little of the city as we neared Kyoto Station, but then, to my astonishment, I caught a glimpse of rooftops reaching as far as the base of hills in the distance. I could never have imagined a city so huge. Even to this day, the sight of streets and buildings from a train often makes me remember the terrible emptiness and fear I felt on that curious day when I first left my home. Back then, around 1930, a fair number of rickshaws still operated in Kyoto. In fact, so many were lined up before the station that I imagine no one went anywhere in the city unless it was in a rickshaw, which couldn't have been farther from the truth. Perhaps 15 or 20 of them sat pitched forward on their poles, with their drivers squatting nearby, smoking or eating. Some of the drivers lay curled up asleep right there in the filth of the street. Hold on, let me just drink. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, perhaps 15 or 20 of them. Yeah, perhaps 15 or 20 of them sat pitched forward into their poles, with their drivers squatting nearby, smoking or eating. Some of the drivers even lay curled up asleep right there in the filth of the street. Mr. Beku led us by our elbows again, as if we were a couple of buckets he was bringing back from the well. He probably thought I'd have run away if he'd let go of me if he'd let go of me a moment, but I wouldn't have. Wherever he was taking us, I preferred it to being cast out alone into that great expanse of streets and buildings, as foreign to me as the bottom of the sea. We climbed into a rickshaw, with Mr. Beku with Mr. Beku squeezed tightly on the bench between us. He was a good deal bonier under that kimono, even than I. Yeah, He was a good deal bonier under that kimono, even than I suspected. Even, even than I expected. We pitched back as the driver raised the poles, and then Mr. Beku said, Tominaga Cho and Guillaume. Sorry if I pronounced this wrong. I know Guillaume. I think it's Guillaume or Guillaume. I'm gonna pronounce it Guillaume. I don't remember how they pronounce it in the movie. This place is gonna be said a lot, so I'm just gonna say Guillaume. It is spelled like that. I can actually just look up right now, see what it says. Guillaume. Pronunciation. Hopefully this will. Chong. Hold on. Guillaume. Oh, okay. Then I am right. But Japanese people, please tell me if I'm wrong. But I think I'm right. Of Guillaume. Was I saying Guillaume? I don't even know. No, I think I was saying Guillaume. Okay, I'm just like overthinking. Totally overthinking. Cool. Okay. Well, yes. Yeah, we pitched back as the driver raised the poles, and then Mr. Beku said, Tominaga Cho and Guillaume. The driver said nothing in reply, but gave the rickshaw a tug to get it moving, and then set off at a trot. After a block or two, I worked up my courage and said to Mr. Beku, Won't you please tell us where we're going? He didn't look as if he were to reply, but after a moment he said, "To your new home." At this, my eyes filled with tears. I heard Setsu weeping on the other side of Mr. Beku, and was just about to let out a sob of my own when Mr. Beku suddenly struck her, and she let out a loud gasp. I bit my I bit my lip and stopped myself so quickly from crying any further that I think the tears themselves may have come to a halt as they slid down my cheek. Soon we turned onto an avenue that seemed as broad as the whole village of Yoroido. I could hardly see the I could hardly see the other side of all the people, bicycles, cars, and trucks. I'd never seen a car before. I'd seen photographs, but I remember being surprised at how, well, cruel. Uh, I'd never seen a car before. I'd seen photographs, but I remember being surprised at how, well, cruel is the way they looked me in my frightened state, as though they were designed to hurt, as though they were designed more to hurt people than to help them. All my senses were assaulted. Trucks stumbled past so close I could smell the scorched rubber odor of their tires. I heard a horrible screech, which turned out to be a streetcar on tracks in the center of the avenue. I felt terrified as evening settled in around us, but I was never so astonished by anything in my life as by my first glimpse of city lights. I've never I've never even seen electricity except during part of our dinner at Mr. Tanaka's house. Here, windows were lit along the buildings, upstairs and down, and the people on the sidewalk stood under puddles of yellow glow. I could see pinpoints even at the far reaches of the avenue. We turned onto another street, and I saw for the first time the Minamiza, the Minamiza, the Minamiza Theater standing on the opposite side of the bridge ahead of us. Its tiled roof was so grand I thought it was a palace. At length, the rickshaw turned down an alleyway of wooden houses. The way they were all packed together, they seemed to share one continuous facade, which yeah, the way they were all packed together, they seemed to share one continuous facade, one which gave me the terrible feeling of being lost. I watched women in kimono rushing around in a great hurry on the little street. They looked very elegant to me, though, as I later learned, they were mostly maids. When we came to a halt before our doorway, Mr. Beku instructed me to get out. He climbed out behind me, and then, as if the day hadn't been difficult enough, the worst thing of all happened. For when Satsu tried to get out as well, Mr. Beku turned and pushed her back with his long arm. "Stay there," he said to her. "You're going elsewhere." I looked at Satsu, and Satsu looked at me. It may have been the first time we'd ever completely understood each other's feelings, but it lasted only a moment. For the next thing I knew, my eyes had welled up with tears so much I could scarcely see. I felt myself being dragged backward by Mr. Beku. I heard women's voices and quite a bit of commotion. I was on the point of throwing myself onto the street when suddenly Satsu's mouth fell open at something she saw in the doorway behind me. I was in a narrow entryway with an ancient-looking well on one side and a few plants on the other. Mr. Beku had dragged me inside, and now he pulled me up to my feet. There, on the step of the entryway, just slipping her feet into her lacquered zori, stood an exquisitely beautiful woman wearing a kimono, lovelier than anything I'd ever imagined. I'd been impressed with the kimono worn by the young buck-toothed geisha at Mr. Tanaka's village in Senzuru. but this one was of water blue, with swirling lines in ivory to mimic the current of the stream. Glistening silver trout tumbled into the current, and the surface of the water was ringed with gold, wherever the soft green leaves of the tree. Yeah, glistening silver trout tumbled in the current, and the surface of the water was ringed with gold wherever the soft green leaves of the tree touched it. I had no I had no doubt the gown was woven of pure silk, and so was the obi, embroidered in pale greens and yellows, and her clothing wasn't the only extraordinary thing about her. Her face was painted a kind of rich yellow, a kind of rich white, like the wall of a cloud when lit by the sun. Her hair, fashioned into lobes, gleamed as darkly as lacquer, and was decorated with ornaments carved out of amber, and with a bar from which tiny silver strips dangled, shimmering as she moved. This was my first glimpse of Hatsumomo. At the time, she was one of the most renowned geisha in the district of Gion, though, of course, I didn't know any of this then. She was a petite woman. Yeah, she was a petite woman. The top of her hairstyle reached no higher than Mr. Beku's shoulder. I was so startled by her appearance that I forgot my that I forgot my manners. Not that I had developed very good manners yet. And stared directly at her face. She was smiling at me, though not in a kindly way. And then she said, "Mr. Beku, could you please take out the garbage later? I'd like to be on my way." There was no garbage in the entryway. She was talking about me. Mr. Beku said he thought Hatsumomo had enough room to pass. "You may not mind being so close to her," said Hatsumomo. "But when I see filth on one side of the street, I walk to the other." Suddenly, an older woman, tall and knobby, like a bamboo pole, appeared in the doorway behind her. "I don't know how anyone puts up with you, Hatsumomo-san," said the woman, but she gestured for Mr. Beku to pull me onto the street again, which he did. After she stepped down into the entryway very awkwardly, for one of her hips jutted out and made it difficult for her to walk, and walked to a tiny cabinet on the wall. She took it from something that looked to me like a piece of flint, along a rectangular stone, like the kind fishermen used to sharpen their knives, and then stood behind Hatsumomo and struck the flint against the stone, causing a little cluster of sparks to jump onto Hatsumomo's back. I didn't understand this at all, but, you see, geisha are more superstitious even than fishermen. A geisha will never go out for the evening until someone has sparked a flint on her back for good luck. After this, Hatsumomo walked away, using such tiny steps that she seemed to glide along the bottom of her kimono, fluttering just a bit. I didn't know that she was a geisha at the time, for she was worlds above the creature I'd seen in Zinzuru a few weeks earlier. I decided she must be some sort of stage performer. We all watched her float away, and then Mr. Beku handed me over to the older woman in the entryway. He climbed back into the rickshaw with my sister, and the driver raised the poles. But I never saw them leave, because I was slumped down in the entryway in tears. The older woman must have taken pity on me. For a long while, I lay there sobbing in my misery without anyone touching me. I even heard her shush up a maid who came from inside the house to speak with her. At length, she helped me to my feet and dried my face with a handkerchief she took from one sleeve of her simple gray kimono. Now, little girl, There's no need to worry so. No one's going to cook you. She spoke with she spoke with the same peculiar accent as Mr. Beku and Hatsumomo. It sounded so different from the Japanese spoken in my village that I had a hard time understanding her. But in any case, hers were the kindest words anyone had said to me all day, so I made up my mind to do what she advised. She told me to call her auntie, and then she looked down at me, square in the face, and said in a throaty voice, "Heavens! What startling eyes! You're a lovely girl, aren't you? Mother will be thrilled." I thought at once that the mother of this woman, whoever she was, must be very old because Auntie's hair, knotted tightly at the back of her head, was mostly gray, with only streaks of black remaining. Auntie led me through the doorway, where I found myself standing on a dirt corridor, passing between two closely spaced structures to a courtyard in the back. One of the structures was a little dwelling like my house in Yoroilo. 2 rooms with floors of dirt. Excuse me. Yeah. Yeah, one of the structures was a little dwelling like my house in Yoroilo. 2 rooms with floors of dirt. It turned out to be the maid's quarters. The other was a small, elegant house sitting up on a foundation of stones, in such a way that a cat might have crawled underneath it. The corridor beneath them opened into the dark sky above, which gave me the feeling I was standing on something more like a miniature village than a house. Especially since I could see several other small wooden buildings down in the courtyard at the end. I didn't know it at the time, but this was a very typical dwelling for the section of Kyoto in which it stood. The buildings in the courtyard, though they gave the impression of another group of tiny houses, were just a small shed for toilets and a storehouse of 2 levels with a ladder on the outside. The entire dwelling fitted into. Hold on. Okay. Uh, yeah, the entire dwelling fitted into an area smaller than Mr. Tanaka's home in the countryside, and housed only 8 people, um, or rather 9 now that I had arrived. After I took in the peculiar arrangement of all the little buildings, I noticed the elegance of the main house. In Yoroilo, the wood structures were more gray than brown, and rutted by the salty air. But here, the wood floors and beams gleamed with a yellow glow, with the yellow light of electric lamps. Opening off the front, opening off the front hallway were sliding doors with paper screens, as well as a staircase that seemed to climb straight up. One of these doors stood open. Wait, hold on. Yeah, opening off the front hallway were sliding doors with paper screens, as well as a staircase that seemed to climb straight up. One of these doors stood open, so that I was able to see a wood cabinet with a Buddhist altar. These elegant these elegant rooms turned out to be for the use of the family, and also Hatsumomo. Even though, as I would come to understand, she wasn't a family member at all. When family members wanted to go, in, when the family member, yeah, when family members wanted to go to the courtyard, they didn't walk down the brick corridor as the servants did, but they had their own ramp of polished wood running along the side of the house. There were even separate toilets, an upper one for the family and a lower one for the servants. I had yet to discover most of these things, though. I, I had yet to discover most of these things, though I would learn them within a day or two. But I stood there in the corridor a long while, wondering what sort of place this was, and feeling very afraid. Auntie had disappeared into the kitchen and was talking in a hoarse voice to somebody. At length, the somebody came out. She turned out to be a girl about my age, carrying a wooden bucket so heavy with water that she sloshed half of it onto the dirt floor. Her body was narrow, but her face was plump and almost perfectly round, so that she looked to me like a melon on a stick. She was straining to carry the bucket, and her tongue stuck out of her mouth just the way the stem comes out the top of a pumpkin. As I soon, as I soon learned, this was a habit of hers. She stuck her tongue out when she stirred her miso soup or scooped rice into a bowl, or even tied the knot of her robe. And her face was truly so plump and so soft, with that tongue tur- with that tongue curling out like a pumpkin stem, that within a few days I'd given her the name of Pumpkin, which everyone came to call her. Even her customers many years later when she was a geisha in Guillaume. When she had put down the bucket near me, Pumpkin retracted her tongue, then brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, while she looked me up and down. I thought she might say something, but she just went on looking, as though she were really trying to make up her mind whether or not to take a bite of me. Really, she did seem hungry, and then at last she leaned in and whispered, "Where on earth did you come from?" I didn't think it would help to say that I had come from Yodo either, since her accent was as strange to me as everyone else's. I felt sure she wouldn't recognize the name of my village. Instead, I said that I'd just arrived. I thought I would never see another girl my age. Yeah, I thought I would never see I thought I would never see another girl my age, she said to me. But what's the matter with your eyes? Just then, Auntie came out of the kitchen and, after shooing Pumpkin away, uh, picked up the bucket and a scrap of cloth and led me down into the courtyard. It had a beautiful mossy look, with stepping stones leading to a storehouse in the back, but it smelled horrible because of the toilets and the little shed along the side. Auntie told me to undress. I was afraid she might do to me something like what Mrs. Fidget had done, but instead she only poured water over my shoulders and rubbed me down with the rag. Afterward, she gave me a robe which was nothing more than coarsely woven cotton in the simplest pattern of dark blue, but it was certainly more elegant than anything I'd ever worn before. An old woman, an old woman who turned out to be the cook, came down into the corridor with several elderly maids to peer at me. Auntie told them they would have plenty of time for staring another day, and sent them back where they'd come from. "Now listen, little girl," Auntie said to me when we were alone. "I don't even want to know your name yet. The last girl who came, Mother and Granny didn't like her, and she was only here a month. I'm too old to keep learning new names until they've decided they're going to keep you." happen if they don't want to keep me? I asked. It's better for you if they keep you. May I ask, ma'am, what is this place? It's an okia, she said. It's where geisha live. If you work very hard, you'll grow up to be a geisha yourself. But you won't make it as far as next week unless you listen to me very closely, because Mother and Granny are coming downstairs in just a moment to look at you, and they'd better like what they see. Your job is to bow as low as you can, and don't look them in the eye. The older one, the one we call Granny, has never liked anyone in her life, so don't worry about what she says. If she asks you a question, don't even answer it. For heaven's sake, I'll answer for you. The one you want to impress is Mother. She's not a bad sort, but she cares about only one thing. Hold on. I need to readjust myself because, my butt is, getting sore. Okay. Yeah. She's not a bad sort, but she cares about only one thing. I didn't have a chance to find out what that one thing was, for I heard a creaking noise in the direction of the front hall, from the direction of the front entrance hall, and soon the two women came drifting out onto the walkway. I didn't dare look at them, but what I could see out the corner of my eye made me think of two lovely bundles of silk floating along a stream. In a moment, they were hovering away on the walkway in front of me, where they sank down and smoothed their kimono across their knees. Umeko-san! Yeah, Umeko-san! Yeah, Umeko-san! Auntie shouted, for this was the name of the cook. Yeah, let me say that again. Umeko-san! Auntie shouted, for this was the name of the cook. Bring tea for Granny. I don't want tea, I heard an angry voice say. Now, Granny, said a raspier voice, which I took to be Mother's. You don't have to drink it. Auntie only wants to be sure you're comfortable. There's no being comfortable with these bones of mine, the old woman grumbled. I heard her take a breath to say something more, but Auntie interrupted. This is the new girl, Mother, she said, and gave me a little shove, which I took as a signal to bow. I got onto my knees and bowed so low, I could smell the musty air wafting from beneath the foundation. Then I heard Mother's voice again. Get up and come closer. I want to have a look at you. Yeah, get up and come closer. I want to have a look at you. I felt certain she was going to say something more to me after I'd approached her, but instead she took from her obi, where she kept it tucked, a pipe with a metal bowl and a long stem made of bamboo. She set it down beside her on the walkway and then brought it from the pocket of her sleeve. She set it down beside her on the walkway and then brought from the pocket of her sleeve a drawstring bag of silk, from which she removed a pinch of tobacco. She packed the tobacco with her little finger, stained the burnt orange color of a roasted yam, and then put the pipe into her mouth and lit it with a match from a tiny metal box. Now she took a close look at me for the first time. puffing on her pipe while the old woman beside her sighed. I didn't feel I could look at Mother directly, but I had the impression of smoke seeping out of her face like steam from a crack in the earth. I was so curious about her that my eyes took on a life of their own and began to dart about. The more I saw of her, the more fascinated I became. Her kimono was yellow, with willowy branches bearing lovely green and orange leaves. It was made of silk gauze as delicate as a spider's web. Her obi was every bit as astonishing to me. It was a lovely gauzy texture too, but heavier looking and russet and brown with gold threads woven through. The more I looked at her clothing, the less I was aware of standing there on that dirt corridor. On that dirt corridor, or of wondering what had become of my sister and my mother and father, and what would become of me. Every detail of this woman's kimono was enough to make me forget myself, and then I came upon a rude shock, for there, above the collar of her elegant kimono, was a face so mismatched to the clothing that it was as though I'd been patting a cat's body, only to discover that it had a bulldog's head. She was a hideous-looking woman, though much younger than Auntie, which I hadn't expected. It turned out that Mother wasn't actually Auntie's younger sister, though they called each other Mother and Auntie, just as everyone else did in the Okia. Just as everyone else in the Okia did. Actually, they weren't really sisters in the way Satsu and I were. They hadn't been born into the same family, but Granny had adopted them both. I was so dazed as I stood there, with so many thoughts running through my mind, that I ended up doing the very thing Auntie told me not to do. I looked straight into Mother's eyes. When I did, she took the pipe from her mouth, which caused her jaw to fall open like a trapdoor. And even though I knew I should at all costs look down again, her peculiar eyes were so shocking to me in their ugliness that I could do nothing but stand there staring at them. Instead of being white and clear, the whites of her eyes had a hideous yellow cast and made me think at once of a toilet into which someone had just urinated. They were rimmed with the raw lip of her lids, in which a cloudy moisture was pooled, and all around them the skin was sagging. I drew my eyes downward as far as her mouth, which still hung open. The colors of her face were all mixed up. The rims of her eyelids were red, like meat, and her gums and tongue were gray. And to make things more horrible, each of her teeth seemed to be anchored in a little pool of blood at the gums. This was due to some sort of deficiency in Mother's diet over the past years, as I later learned. But I couldn't help feeling, the more I looked at her, that she was like a tree that had begun to lose its leaves. I was so shocked by the whole effect that I think I must have taken a step back, or even let out a gasp, or in some way given her a hint of my feelings, for all at once she said to me in that raspy voice of hers, "What are you looking at?" "I'm very sorry, ma'am. I was looking at your kimono," I told her. "I don't think I've ever seen anything like it." This must have been the right answer, if there was a right answer, because she let out something of a laugh, though it sounded like a cough. "So you like it, do you?" she said, continuing to laugh or cough, I couldn't tell which. "Do you have any idea what it costs?" "No, ma'am." "More than you did, that's for certain." Here the maid appeared with tea. While it was served, I took the opportunity to steal a glance at Granny. Whereas Mother was a bit on the plump side, with stubby fingers and a fat neck, Granny was old and shriveled. She was at least as old as my father, but she looked as if she'd spent her years stowing herself into a state of concentrated meanness. Her gray hair made me think of a tangle of silk threads, for I could see right through them. Yeah, her gray hair made me think of a tangle of silk threads, for I could see right through them to her scalp. And even her scalp looked mean, because of patches where the skin was colored red and brown from old age. She wasn't frowning exactly, but her mouth made the shape of a frown in its natural state anyway. She took in a deep breath in preparation to speak, and then as she let it out again, she mumbled, "Didn't I say I don't want any tea?" After this, she sighed and shook her head and then said to me, "How old are you, little girl?" "She's the year of the monkey," Auntie answered for me. "That fool cook is a monkey," Granny said. "9 years old," said Mother. "What do you think of her, Auntie?" Auntie stepped around in front of me and tipped my head back to look at my face. "She has a good deal of water." "Lovely eyes," said Mother. "Did you see them, Granny?" "She looks like a fool to me," Granny said. We don't need another monkey anyway." "Oh, I'm sure you're right," Auntie said. "Probably she's just as you say, but she looks to me like a very clever girl, and adaptable. You can see from the shape of her eye. You can see that from the shape of her ears. With so much water in her personality." "Yeah, with so much water in her personality," Mother said. "Probably she'll be able to smell a fire before it has even begun. Won't that be nice, Granny? You won't have to worry any longer about our storehouse burning with all our kimono in it." Granny, as I went on to learn, was more terrified of fire than beer is of a thirsty old man. Let me adjust myself. Okay, there we go. Get off. Okay. Alright. I just thought to myself just now, man, when does this fucking chapter end? And then I look at the next page and it ends like shortly after starting the next page. I'm like, oh, there we go. Damn, this chapter was long. Yeah. Granny, as I went on to learn, was more terrified of fire than beer is of a thirsty old man. Anyway, she's rather pretty, don't you think? Mother added. "There are too many pretty girls in Guion," said Granny. "What we need is a smart girl, not a pretty girl. That Hatsumo is as pretty as they come, and look at what a fool she is." After this, Granny stood, with Auntie's help, and made her way back up the walkway. Though I must say that to watch Auntie's clumsy gait, because of her one hip jutting out farther than the other, it wasn't at all obvious which of the two women had the easier time walking. Soon I heard the sound of a door, and Yeah, soon I heard the sound of a door in the front entrance slide. Yeah, soon I heard the sound of a door in the front entrance hall sliding open and then shut again. And Auntie came back. Do you have lice, little girl? Mother asked me. No, I said. You're going to have to learn to speak more politely than that. Auntie, be kind enough to trim her hair, just to be sure. Auntie called a servant over and asked for shears. Well, little girl, Mother told me, you're in Kyoto now. You'll learn to behave or get a beating. And it's Granny. I think I found a typo. Or maybe it's supposed to be like that. The original, what it says, and it's Granny gives the beatings around here. But shouldn't it be, it's Granny giving, and it'll be Granny, yeah, there shouldn't be an it. And Granny gives the beatings around here. So you'll be sorry. Yeah, I think it's a typo. Though it might not be. But it doesn't make any sense to me. And it's Granny gives the beatings around here. I mean, it could be like kind of slang. Well, not slang, but like. Yeah, but it doesn't have the who. Yeah. So it's probably a typo. So yeah, I'll just say it. It's Granny who. It's Granny who gave. Yeah. Well, little girl, Mother told me, you're in Kyoto now. You'll learn to behave or get a beating. And it's Granny who gives the beatings around here, so you'll be sorry. My advice to you is work very hard and never leave the Okia without permission. Do as you're told, don't be too much trouble, and you might begin learning the arts of a geisha 2 or 3 months from now. I didn't bring you here to be a maid. I'll throw you out if it comes to that. Mother puffed on her pipe and kept her eyes fixed on me. I didn't dare move until she told me to. I found myself wondering if my sister was standing before some other cruel woman in another house, somewhere in this horrible city. And I had a sudden image in my mind of my poor, sick mother, propping herself up on one elbow upon her futon and looking around to see where we have gone. I didn't want Mother to see me crying, but the tears pooled in my eyes before I could think of how to stop them. With my vision glazed, Mother's yellow kimono turned softer and softer until it seemed to sparkle. Then she threw out a puff of her smoke, and with my vision glazed, Mother's yellow kimono turned softer and softer until it seemed to sparkle. Then she blew out a puff of her smoke, and it disappeared completely. And that is the end of that chapter. That was a long ass chapter, man. Okay, chapter 4. Sorry. I'm just like trying to adjust myself so like I don't get my butt all numb from the way I'm sitting. Oh. Alright. Chapter 4. During those first few days in that strange place, I don't think I could have felt worse if I'd lost my arms and legs, rather than my family and my home. I had no doubt life would never again be the same. All I could think of was my confusion and misery, and I wondered day after day when I might see Satsu again. I was without my father, without my mother, without even the clothing I had always worn. Yet somehow the thing that startled me the most, after a week or two had passed, was that I had in fact survived. I remember one moment drying rice bowls in the kitchen, when all at once I felt so disoriented I had to stop what I was doing to stare for a long while at my hands, for I could scarcely understand that this person drying the bowls was actually me. Mother had told me I could begin my training within a few months if I worked hard and behaved myself. As I learned from him, as I learned from Pumpkin, beginning my training meant going to a school in another section of Guion to take lessons in things like music, dance, and tea ceremony. All the girls studying to be geisha took classes at the same school. I felt sure I'd find Satsu there when I was finally permitted to go. So by the end of my first week, I had made up my mind to be as obedient as a cow following along a rope, in hopes that Mother would send me to the school right away. Most of my chores were straightforward. I stowed away the futons in the morning, cleaned the rooms, swept the Doric corridor, and so forth. Sometimes I was sent to the pharmacist to fetch ointment for the cook's scabies, or for or to a shop on Shijo Avenue to fetch the rice crackers Auntie was so fond of. Happily, the worst jobs, such as cleaning the toilets, were the responsibility of one of the elderly maids. But even though I worked as hard as I knew how, I never seemed to make the good. I never knew. Uh, uh, but even though I worked as hard as I knew how, I never seemed to make the good impression I hoped to, because my chores every day were more than I could possibly finish, and the problem was made a good deal worse by Granny. Looking after Granny wasn't really one of my duties, not as Auntie described them to me, but when Granny summoned me, I couldn't very well ignore her, for she had more seniority in the Okia than anyone else. One day, for example, I was to carry tea upstairs to Mother when I heard Granny call out, "Where's that girl? Send her in here!" I had to put down Mother's tray and hurry into the room where Granny was eating her lunch. "Can't you see this room is too hot?" she said to me after I'd bowed to her on my knees. You ought to have come in here and opened the window. I'm sorry, Granny. I didn't know you were hot. Don't I look hot? She was eating some rice, and several grains of it were stuck to her lower lip. I thought she looked more mean than hot, but when I but when I direct, yeah, but I went directly to the window and opened it. As soon as I did, a fly came in and began buzzing around Granny's food. What's the matter with you? She said, waving the fly with her chopsticks. The other maids don't let in flies when they open the window. I apologized and told her I would fetch us water. And knock the fly into my food? Oh no, you won't. You'll stand right here while I eat and keep it away from me. So I had to stand there while Granny ate her food and listen to her tell me about the great kabuki actor Ichimura Uzamon the 14th. He had taken her hand during a moon viewing party when she was only 14. By the time I was finally free to leave, Mother's tea had grown so cold I couldn't deliver it. Both the cook and Mother were angry with me. The truth was, Granny didn't like to be alone. Even when she needed to use the toilet, she made Auntie stand just outside the door and hold her hands to help her balance the squatting position. The odor was so overpowering, poor Auntie nearly broke her neck trying to get her head as far away from it as possible. I didn't have any jobs as bad as this one, but Granny did often call me to massage her while she cleaned her ears with a tiny silver scoop. And the task of massaging her was a good deal worse than you might think. I almost felt sick the first time she unfastened her robe and pulled it down from her shoulders, because the skin there and on her neck was bumpy and yellow, like an uncooked chicken's. The problem, as I later learned, was that in her geisha days, she used a kind of white makeup we call china clay, because she'd used a kind of white makeup we call china clay, made with a base of lead. China clay turned out to be poisonous to begin with, which probably accounted for part of Granny's foul disposition. But also, as a young woman, Granny had often gone to the hot springs north of Kyoto. This would have been fine, except that the lead-based makeup was very hard to remove. Traces of it combined with some sort of chemical in the water to make a dye ruined her skin. Granny wasn't the only one afflicted by this problem. Even during the early years of World War II, you could still see old women on the streets of Guillaume with sagging yellow necks, which I heard was a thing, and that's fucking crazy, man. One day, after I had been in the Okia for 3 weeks, I went upstairs much later than usual to straighten Hatsumomo's room. I was terrified of Hatsumomo. Yeah, man. Really is. Which also, if you buy, of course, if you're willing to buy, off, the thing is, I'm trying to tell you, if you want to buy brand makeup, let's say, I don't know, Kylie Jenner or something like that, just don't buy shit online. That shit is bad, because you don't know who you might think that, oh, that's a really good seller, but or if they're feeling they're some people, some evil people will make it seem like they're selling like a legit like Kylie Jenner like brand shit. There's like a thing on Netflix, like a documentary on Netflix too, saying I don't know what it's called, but it's basically like fake stuff or something like that. I don't know. I think I have it on my list. But it's basically like when people buy things that they think are the legit like brand, and it's like for cheap, and it turns out to be like something else completely, and sometimes it ruins people's skin or like their lives. Shit, dude, you're better off just buying that brand or buying a cheaper brand. But I wouldn't. I would never. I mean, I don't wear makeup at all, or most of the time I don't. But like, just go to Ulta and see like what's good. But don't buy online. You don't know what people do. It might seem like the official brand, but sometimes it's not. Either go to the official brand's website and be like, I want this makeup, or just go to Ulta or your beauty store and then, you know, find something. Don't try to buy stuff online unless, like I said, it's from the actual brand and not someone that's like, hey, I've got the brand, I'll sell it to you for a lot less. No, don't do that. Don't. Just don't. No, no, no. Okay. Uh, yeah. One day after I'd been in the IKEA for about yeah. One day after I'd been in the IKEA about 3 weeks, I went upstairs much later than usual to straighten Hatsumomo's room. I was terrified of Hatsumomo, even though I hardly saw her because of the busy life she led. I worried about what might happen if she found me alone. So I always try to clean her room the moment she left the IKEA for her dance lessons. But unfortunately, that morning, Granny had kept me busy until almost noon. Hatsumomo's room was the largest in the IKEA. Yeah, in the IKEA. Larger in floor space than my entire house in Yoroido. I couldn't think why it should be so much bigger than everyone else's until one of the elderly maids told me that even though Hatsumomo was the only geisha in the IKEA now, yeah, I couldn't think why it should be so much bigger than everyone else's room until one of the elderly maids told me that even though Hatsumomo was the only geisha in the IKEA now, in the past there had been as many as 3 or 4, and they'd all slept together in that one room. Hatsumomo may have lived alone, but she certainly made enough mess for 4 people. When I went up to her room that day, in addition to the usual magazines strewn about and the brushes left on the mats near her tiny makeup stand, I found an apple core and an empty whiskey bottle under the table. The window was open, and the wind must have knocked down the wood frame. Yeah, and the wind must have knocked down the wood frame on which she'd hung her kimono from the night before. Or perhaps she tipped it over going to bed drunk and hadn't yet bothered to pick it up. Usually, Auntie would have fetched the kimono by now, because it was her responsibility to take. Good night. Yeah, usually Auntie would have fetched the kimono by now, because it was her responsibility to care for the clothing in the Okia. But for some reason she hadn't. Just as I was standing. Sorry, I gotta adjust myself again. Man, and my pajama top keeps on like lighting up, like moving and shit. And it's just like, can you please stop that? Okay. Yeah, but for some reason she hadn't. Just as I was standing the frame, or yeah, just as I was standing the frame erect again, the door slid open all at once, and I turned to see Hatsumo standing there. "Oh, it's you," she said. "I thought I heard a little mousey or something. I see you've been straightening my room. Are you the one who keeps rearranging all my makeup jars? Why do you insist on doing that?" "I'm very sorry, ma'am," I said. "I only moved them to dust underneath." Hold on, just 1 second. Okay. Yeah, I only moved them to dust underneath. Yeah, I only moved them to dust underneath. But if you touch them, she said, they'll start to smell like you. And then the man will say to me, "Hatsumomo-san, why do you stink like an ignorant girl from a fishing village?" I'm sure you understand that, don't you? But let's have you repeat it back to me, just to be sure. Why don't I want you to touch my makeup? I could hardly bring myself to say it, but at last I answered her. Because it will start to smell like me? That's very good. And what will the men say? They'll say, "Oh, Hatsumomo-san, you smell just like that girl from the fishing village." There's something about the way you said that I don't like. But I suppose it will do. I can't see why you girls from fishing villages smell so bad. That ugly sister of yours was here looking for you the other day, and her stench was nearly as bad as yours. I kept my eyes on the floor until then, but when I heard these words, I looked Hatsumomo right in the face to see whether or not she was telling me the truth. "You look so surprised," she said to me. "Didn't I mention that she came here? She wanted me to give you a message about where she's living. Probably she wants you to go find her, so the two of you can run away together." "Hatsumomo-san, you want me to tell you where she is?" "Yeah, you want me to tell you where she is? Well, you're going to have to earn the information. When I think how, I'll tell you. Now get out." I didn't dare disobey her, but just before leaving the room, I stopped, thinking perhaps I could persuade her. Hatsumomo-san, I know you don't like me, I said. If you would be kind enough to tell me what I want to know, I'll promise never to bother you again. Hatsumomo looked very pleased when she heard this and came walking toward me with a luminous happiness in her face. Honestly, I've never seen a more astonishing-looking woman. Men in the street sometimes stopped and took their cigarettes from their mouths to stare at her. I thought she was going to come to whisper in my ear, but after she's... Yeah, yeah, I thought she was going to come whisper in my ear, but after she stood over me smiling for a moment, she drew back her hand and slapped me. I told you to get out of my room, didn't I? She said. I was too stunned to know how to react, but I must have stumbled out of the room, because the next thing I knew, I was slumped on the wood floor of the hallway, holding my hand to my face. In a moment, Mother's door slid open. Hatsumomo! Mother said, and came to help me to my feet. What have you done to Chio? She was talking about running away, Mother. I decided it would be best if I slapped her for you. I thought you were probably too busy to do it yourself. Mother summoned a maid and asked for several slices of fresh ginger, then took me into her room and seated me at the table while she finished a telephone call. The Okia's only telephone for calling outside Gion was mounted on the wall of her room, and no one else was permitted to use it. She'd left the earpiece lying on its side with the shelf, and when she took it up again, she seemed to squeeze it so hard with her stubby fingers that I thought fluid might drip onto the mats. Sorry, she said into the mouthpiece in her raspy voice. Hatsumomo was slapping the maids around again. During my first few weeks in the Okia, I felt an unreasonable affection for Mother. Something like what a fish might feel for the fisherman who pulls the hook from its lips. Probably this was because I saw her no more than a few minutes each day while cleaning her room. She was always to be found there, sitting at the table, usually with an account book from the bookcase open before her, and the fingers of one hand flicking the ivory beads of her abacus. Of her, let me see how to, abacus. Abacus. She was always to be found there, sitting at the table, usually with an account book from the bookcase open before her, and the fingers of one hand flicking the ivory beads of her abacus. Flicking the ivory beads of her abacus. She may have been organized about keeping her account books, but in every other respect, she was mussier even than Hatsumomo. Whenever she put her pipe down onto the table with a click, flecks of ash and tobacco flew out of it, and she left them wherever she lay. She didn't like anyone to touch her futon, even to change the sheets. When the whole room smelled like dirty linen. She didn't like anyone to touch her futon, even to change the sheets. So the whole room smelled like dirty dirty linen, and the paper screens over the windows were stained terribly on account of her smoking, which gave the room a gloomy cast. While Mother went on talking on the telephone, one of the elderly maids came in with with several strips of freshly cut ginger for me to hold against my face where Hatsumomo had slapped me. The commotion of the door opening and closing woke Mother's little dog, Taku. He was an ill-tempered creature with a smashed face. He seemed to have only three pastimes in life: to bark, to snore, and to bite people who tried to pet him. After the maid had left again, Taku came and laid himself behind me. This was one of his little tricks. He liked to put himself where I could step on him by accident, and then bite me as soon as I did it. I was beginning to feel like a mouse caught in a sliding door, positioned there between Mother and Taku. When at last Mother hung up the telephone and came to sit at the table, she stared at me with her yellow eyes and finally said, "Now listen to me, little girl. Perhaps you've heard Hatsumomo lying. Just because she can get away with it doesn't mean you can. I want to know, why did she slap you?" "She wanted me to leave her room, Mother," I said. "I'm terribly sorry." Mother made me say it all again in a proper Kyoto accent, which I found difficult to do. When I'd finally said it well enough to satisfy her, she went on. "I don't think you understand your job here in the Okia. We all think, uh, we, we all of us think of only one thing: how we can help Hatsumomo be successful as a geisha. Even Granny, she may seem like a difficult old woman to you, but really she spends her whole day thinking of ways to be help. But really she spends her whole day thinking of ways to be helpful to Hatsumomo." I didn't have the least idea what Mother was talking about. To tell the truth, I don't think she could have fooled a dirty rag into believing Granny was in any way helpful to anyone. If anyone as senior as Granny works hard all day to make Hatsumomo's job easier, think how much harder you have to work. Yes, Mother, I'll continue working very hard. I don't want to hear that you've upset Hatsumomo again. The other little girl manages to stay out of her way. You can do it too. Yes, Mother, but before I go, may I ask? I've been wondering if anyone might know where my sister is. You see, I'd hoped to send her a note to her. Yeah, you see, I'd hoped to send a note to her. Mother had a peculiar mouth, which was too big for her face and hung open much of the time. But now she did something with it that I'd never seen her do. Which was to pinch her teeth together, as though she wanted me to have a good look at them. This was her way of smiling, though I didn't realize it until she began to make that coughing noise that was her laugh. "Why on earth should I tell you such a thing?" she said. After this, she gave her coughing laugh a few more times before waving her hand at me to say I should leave the room. When I went out, Auntie was waiting in the upstairs hall with a chore for me. She gave me a bucket and set me up the ladder through a trapdoor to the roof. There was Yeah, there was a wooden there there on wooden struts stood a tank. Yeah, there on wooden struts stood a tank for collecting rainwater. The rainwater ran down by gravity. Yeah, the rainwater ran down by gravity to flush the little second floor toilet near Mother's room, for we had no plumbing those days, even in the kitchen. Lately, the weather had been dry and the toilet had begun to stink. My task was to dump water into the tank so that Auntie could flush the toilet a few times to clear it out. Those tiles in the noonday, those tiles in the noonday sun felt like hot skillets to me. While I emptied the bucket, I couldn't help but think of the cold water of the pond where we used to swim back at our village on the seashore. I'd been in that pond only a few weeks earlier, but it all seemed so far away from me now. There on the roof of the Okia, Auntie called up to me to pick the weeds from between the tiles before I came back down. I looked I looked out at the hazy heat lying on the city and the hills surrounding us like prison walls. Somewhere under one of those rooftops, my sister was probably doing her chores just as I was. I thought of her when I bumped the tank by accident and the water splashed out and flowed toward the street. About a month after I had arrived in the Okia, Mother told me the time had come to begin my schooling. I was to accompany Pumpkin the following morning to be introduced to teachers. Afterward, Hatsumomo would take me to some place called the registry office, which I'd never heard of. And then late in the afternoon, I would observe her putting on her makeup and dressing in kimono. It was a tradition in the Okia for a young girl on the day she begins her training to observe the most senior geisha in this way. When Pumpkin heard she would be taking me to the school the following morning, she grew very nervous. You'll have to be ready to leave the moment she. Yeah, you'll have to be ready the moment. Uh, you'll have to be ready to leave the moment you wake up, she told me. If we're late, we may as well drown ourselves in the sewer. I'd seen Pumpkin scramble out of the Okia every morning so early her eyes were still crusty, and she often seemed on the point of tears when she left. In fact, when she clomped in fact, when she clopped past the, when she clopped back, sorry, I keep wanting to say clomped, but it's clopped. In fact, when she clopped past the kitchen window in her wooden shoes, I sometimes thought I could hear her crying. She hadn't taken to her lessons well. Not well at all, as a matter of fact. She had arrived in the Okia nearly 6 months before me, but she'd only begun attending the school a week or so after my arrival. Most days when she came back around noon, she hid straight away in the maids' quarters so no one would see her upset. The following morning, I awoke even earlier than usual and dressed for the first time in the blue and white robe students wore. It was nothing more than unlined cotton decorated with a childlike decoration of squares. I'm sure I looked more elegant than a guest at the inn. I'm sure I looked no more elegant than a guest at an inn looks wearing a robe on the way to the bath. But I'd never before worn anything nearly so glamorous on my body. Pumpkin was waiting for me in the entry, in the entryway with a worried look. I was just about to slip my feet into my shoes when Granny called me to her room. No! Uh, hold on. I wasn't paying attention to what I was reading just then. Yeah, Pumpkin was waiting for me in the entryway with a worried look. I was just about to slip my feet into my shoes when Granny called me to her room. No! Uh, no! Uh, Pumpkin said under her breath, and really, her face sagged like wax that had melted. I'll be late again. Let's just go and pretend we didn't hear her. I'd like to have done what Pumpkin suggested, but already Granny was in her doorway, glowering at me. The formal, uh, yeah, but Granny was in her doorway, glowering at me across the formal entrance hall. As it turned out, she didn't keep me more than 10 or 15 minutes, but by then, tears were welling up in Pumpkin's eyes. When we finally set out, Pumpkin began at once to walk so fast I could hardly keep up with her. That old woman is so cruel, she said. Make sure you put your hands in a dish of salt after she makes you rub her neck. Why would I do that? My mother used to say to me, evil spreads in the world through touch. And I know it's true too, because my mother brushed up against a demon that passed her on the road one morning, and that's why she died. If you don't purify your hands, you'll turn it into a shriveled up old pickle, just like Granny. Considering that Pumpkin and I were the same age and in the same peculiar position in life, I'm sure we would have talked together often, if we could have. But our chores kept us so busy we hardly had time even for meals, which Pumpkin ate before me because she was senior in the Okia. I knew that Pumpkin had come only 6 months before me, as I have mentioned, but I knew very little else about her, so I asked, Pumpkin, are you from Kyoto? Your accent sounds like you are. I was born in Sapporo, but then my mother died when I was 5, and my father sent me here to live with an uncle. Last year, my uncle lost his business, and here I am. Why don't you run away to Sapporo again? My father had put a curse on him and died last year. I can't run away. I don't have anywhere to go. When I find my sister, he said, you can come with us. We'll run away together. Considering what a difficult time Pumpkin was having with her lessons, I expected she would be happy at my offer, but she didn't say anything. Yeah, but she didn't say anything at all. We had reached Geisha Avenue by now and crossed it in silence. This was the same avenue that had been so crowded the day Mr. Baku had brought Satsu and me from the station. Now, so early in the morning, I could see only a single streetcar in the distance and a few bicyclists here and there. When we reached the other side, we continued up a narrow street, and then Pumpkin stopped for the first time since we'd left the Okia. My uncle was a very nice man, she said. Ugh. Yeah, my My uncle was a very nice man, she said. Here's this here's the last thing I heard him say before he sent me away. Some girls are smart and some girls are stupid, he told me. You're a nice girl, but you're one of the stupid ones. You won't make it on your own in the world. I'm sending you to a place where people will tell you what to do. Do what they say, and you'll always be taken care of. So if you want to go out on your own, Chiu-chan, you go. Me? I found a place to spend my life. I'll work as hard as I have to so they don't send me away. But I'd sooner throw myself off a cliff than spoil my chances to be a geisha like Hatsumomo. Here, Pumpkin interrupted herself. She was looking at something behind me, on the ground. Oh my goodness, Chiu-chan, she said. Doesn't it make you hungry? I turned to find myself looking... I turned to find myself looking into the entryway of another okiya. On the shelf inside the door sat a miniature Shinto shrine with an offering of a sweet rice cake. I wondered if this could be what Pumpkin had seen, but her eyes were pointed toward the ground. A few ferns and some moss lined the stone path leading to the interior door, but I could see nothing else there. And then my eye fell upon it. Outside the entryway, at the edge of the street, lay a wooden skewer with a single bite of charcoal roasted squid remaining. The vendor sold them from carts at night. The smell of the sweet basting sauce was a torment to me, for maids like us were fed nothing more than rice and pickles at most meals, with soup once a day, and small portions of dried fish once a month, and small portions of dried fish twice a month. Even so, there was nothing about this piece of squid on the ground that I found appetizing. Two flies were walking around in circles. Two flies were walking around in circles on it just as casually as if they'd been out for a stroll in the park. Pumpkin was a girl who looked as if she could grow fat quickly, given the chance. I had sometimes heard her stomach making noises from hunger that sounded like an enormous door rolling open. Still, I didn't think she was really planning to eat the squid until I saw her look up and down the street to be sure no one was coming. Pumpkin, I said, if you're hungry, for heaven's sake, take the sweet rice cake from that shelf. The flies have already claimed the squid. I'm bigger than they are, she said. Besides, it would be sacrilege to eat the sweet rice cake. It's an offering. And after she said this, she bent down to pick up the skewer. It's true that I grew up in a place where children experimented with eating anything that moved, but I'll admit I did eat a cricket once when I was 4 or 5, but only because someone tricked me. But to see Pumpkin standing there, holding that piece of squid on a stick with grit from the street stuck to it, and the flies walking around, she blew on it to try to get rid of them, and they just scamper to keep their balance. Pumpkin, you can't eat that, I said. You might as well drag your tongue along the paving stones. What's so bad about the paving stones? She said. And with this, I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself. Pumpkin got down on her knees and stuck out her tongue and gave it a long, careful scrape along the ground. My mouth fell open from shock. When Pumpkin got to her feet again, she looked as though she herself couldn't quite believe what she'd done, but she wiped her tongue with the palm of her hand, spat a few times, and then put that piece of squid in between her teeth and slid it off the skewer. It must have been a tough piece of squid. Pumpkin chewed it the whole way up the gentle hill, to the wooden gate of the school complex. I felt a knot in my stomach when I entered, because the garden seemed so ground to me. Evergreen shrubs and yo, that's gross. Yeah, that's fucking gross. But hey, you gotta do what you gotta do to survive, man. And with what they're getting for food, it doesn't seem like much. Yep, that's true. Uh, yeah, yeah. Uh, yeah. Yeah, I felt a knot in my stomach when I entered, because the garden seemed so grand to me. Evergreen shrubs and twisted pine trees. Sorry, I had to have to adjust myself again. I'm just like, oh. Yeah, I felt a knot in my stomach when I entered, because the garden seemed so grand to me. Evergreen shrubs and twisted pine trees surrounded a decorative pond full of carp. Across the narrowest par- across the narrowest part of the pond lay a stone slab. Two old women in kimono stood on it, holding lacquered umbrellas to block the early morning sun. As for the buildings, I didn't understand what I was seeing at the moment, but I now know that only a tiny part of the compound was devoted to the school. The massive building in the back. Yeah, the massive. Yeah, the massive building in the back was actually the Kaburen, Kaburenjo. Yeah, the Kaburenjo Theater, where the Geisha of Gion perform dances of the old capital every spring. Ugh. Yeah, the massive building in the back was actually the Kaburenjo Theater, where the Geisha of Gion perform dances of the old capital every spring. Pumpkin hurried to the entrance of a long wood building that I thought was servants' quarters, but which turned out to be the school. The moment I stepped into the entryway, I noticed the distinctive smell of roasted tea leaves, which even now can make my stomach tighten, as though I'm on my way to lessons once again. Hold on, let me say it again, because I wasn't paying attention to what I was reading. Sorry. Yeah, Pumpkin hurried to the entrance of a long wood building that I thought was the servants that I saw what I, that I thought was servants' quarters, but which turned out to be the school. The moment I stepped into the entryway, I noticed the distinctive smell of roasted tea leaves, which even now can make my stomach tighten as though I'm on my way to lessons once again. I took off my shoes to put them into the cubby nearest the hand, but Pumpkin stopped me. There was an unspoken rule about which cubby to use. Pumpkin was among the most junior of all the girls, and had to climb the other cubbies like a ladder to put her shoes at the top. Since this was my very first morning, I had even less seniority. I had to use the cubby above hers. Yeah, I had to use the cubby above hers. Be very careful not to step on the other shoes when you climb, Pumpkin said to me, even though even though there were only a few pairs. If you step on them and one of the girls sees you do it, you'll get a scolding so bad your ears will blister. The interior of the school building seemed to me as old and dusty as an abandoned house. At the end of the long hallway stood a group of 6 or 8 girls. I felt a jolt when I set eyes on them, because I thought one might be Satsu. But when they turned to look at us, I was disappointed. They all wore the same hairstyle. The Warashinobu, a young apprentice geisha. Yeah, they all wore the same hairstyle. The Warashinobu of a young apprentice geisha, and looked to me as if they knew much more about Gion than either Pumpkin or I would ever know. Halfway down the hall, we went into a spacious classroom in the traditional Japanese style. Along one wall hung a large board with pegs holding many tiny wooden plaques. Hold on just a moment. Okay. Actually, wait, hold on. Can't sit in the same position for too long. We'll get tired. Man, I am getting old. But yeah, uh, yeah, halfway down the hall, we went into a spacious classroom in the traditional Japanese style. Along one wall hung a large board with pegs holding many tiny wooden plaques. On each plaque was written a name in fat black strokes. My reading and writing were still poor. I'd attended school in the mornings in Yoroido, and since coming to Kyoto had spent an hour every afternoon studying with Auntie. But I could read very few of the names. Pumpkin went to the board and took from uh, sorry, I thought I heard like a dog barking. But yeah, um, Yeah, Pumpkin went to the board and took from a shallow box. Yeah, Pumpkin went to the board and took from a shallow box on the mat a plaque bearing her own name, which she hung on the first empty hook. The board on the wall, you see, was like a sign-up sheet. After this, we went to several other classrooms to sign up in just the same way for Pumpkin's other lessons. She was to have 4 classes that morning: shamisen, dance, tea ceremony, and a form of singing we call nagauta. Uh, Pumpkin was so troubled about being the last. Yeah, Pumpkin was so troubled about being the last student in all her classes that she began to wring the sash of her robe as we left the school for breakfast in the okia. But just as we slipped into her shoes, another young girl our age came running across the garden with her hair in disarray. Pumpkin seemed calmer after seeing her. We ate a bowl. Yeah, we ate a bowl of soup and returned to the school as quickly as we could, so that Pumpkin could kneel on the back of the classroom as um, so that Pumpkin could kneel in the back of the classroom to assemble her shamisen. If you've never seen a shamisen, you might find it a peculiar looking instrument. Some people call it a Japanese guitar, but it's actually a good deal smaller than a guitar, with a thin wooden neck and 3 large tuning pegs at each end. The body is just a little wooden box with cat skin stretched over the top like a drum. The entire the entire instrument can be taken apart and put into a box or a bag, which is how it is which how which is how it is carried about. In any case, Pumpkin assembled her shamisen and began to tune it with her tongue poking out. But I'm sorry to say that her ear was very poor, and the notes went up and down like a boat on the waves, without ever settling down when they were supposed to be. Soon, the classroom was full of girls with their shamisens, spaced out as neatly. Oh, yeah. Yes, they do. And they're very pretty looking, too. But yeah. Uh, Soon the classroom was full of girls with their shamisens, spaced out as neatly as chocolates in a box. I kept an eye out. Yeah, I kept an eye on the door in hopes that Setsu would walk through it, but she didn't. A moment later, the teacher entered. She was a tiny old woman with a shrill voice. Her name was Teacher Mizumi, and this was what we called her to her face. But her surname of Mizumi sounds very close to Nizumi, mouse. So behind her back, we called her Teacher Nizumi, Teacher Mouse. Teacher Mouse knelt on a cushion facing the class and made no effort at all to look friendly. When the students bowed to her in unison and told her good morning, she just glowed back at them without speaking a word. Finally, she looked at the board on the wall and called out the name of the first student. This first girl seemed to have a pretty high opinion of herself. After she glided to the front of the room, she bowed before the teacher and began to play. In a minute or two, Teacher Mouse told the girl to stop and said all sorts of unpleasant things about her playing, that she snapped her fan shut and waved it at the girl to dismiss her. The girl thanked her, bowed again, and returned to her place, and Teacher Mouse called the name of the next student. This went on for more than an hour until at length Pumpkin's name was called. I could see that Pumpkin was nervous, and in fact, the moment she began to play, everything seemed so wrong. First, herself. Yeah, first, first Teacher Mouse stopped her and took the shamisen to retune the strings herself. Then Pumpkin tried again, but all the students began looking at one another, for no one could tell what piece she was trying to play. Teacher Mouse slapped the table very loudly and told them all to face straight ahead. Then she used her folding fan to tap out the rhythm for Pumpkin to follow. This didn't help, so finally Teacher Mouse began to work instead on Pumpkin's manner of holding the spectrum. She nearly sprained every one of every one of Pumpkin's fingers, it seemed to me, trying to make her hold it with the proper grip. At last she gave up even on this and let the spectrum fall to the mats in disgust. Pumpkin picked it up and came back to her place with tears in her eyes. After this, I learned why Pumpkin had been so worried about being the last student. Because now the girl with the disheveled hair, who had been rushing to the school as we left breakfast, came to the front of the room and bowed. "Don't waste your time trying to be courteous to me," Teacher Mouse squeaked at her. "If you hadn't slept so late this morning, you would have arrived here in time to learn something." The girl apologized and soon began to play, but the teacher paid no attention at all. She just said, "You sleep too late in the mornings. How do you expect me to teach you when you can't take the trouble to come to school like the other girls and sign up properly? Just go back to your place. I don't want to be bothered with you." The class was dismissed, and Pumpkin led me to the front of the room. Pumpkin led me to the front of the room, where we bowed to Teacher Mouse. "May I be permitted to introduce you to you, teacher?" Pumpkin said, "and ask your indulgence in instructing her, because she's a girl of very little talent." Pumpkin wasn't trying to insult me. This was just the way people spoke back then, when they wanted to be polite. My own mother would have said it the same way. Teacher Mouse didn't speak for a long while, but just looked at me. Teacher Mouse didn't speak for a long while, but just looked at me over and then said, "You're a clever girl. I can see it just from looking at you. Perhaps you can help your older sister with your lessons." Of course, she was talking about Pumpkin. "Put your name on the board as early every morning as you can," she told me. "Keep quiet in the classroom. I tolerate no talking at all. And your eyes must stay to the front. If you do these things, I'll teach you as best I can." And with this, she dismissed us. In the hallway between classes, I kept my eyes open for Satsu, but I didn't see her. I began to worry that perhaps I would never see her again, and grew so upset that one of the teachers, just before beginning the class, silenced everyone around me. "You there! What's troubling you?" "Oh, nothing, ma'am. Only I bit my lip by accident," I said, and to make good of this, for the sake of the girls around me who were staring, I gave a sharp bite on my lip and tasted blood. It was a relief to me that Pumpkin's other classes weren't as painful to watch as the first one had been. In the dance class, for example, the students practiced the moves in unison, with the result that no one stood out. Pumpkin wasn't by any means the worst dancer, and even had a certain awkward grace in the way she moved. The singing class later in the morning was more difficult for her since she had a poor ear, but there again, the students practiced in unison, so Pumpkin was able to hide her mistakes by moving her mouth a great deal while singing only softly. Oh shit. Poor man. Getting chewed up with the teacher. Yeah. That hurts. Sorry, man. I didn't see the Discord didn't give me a bloop or something. I'll try to watch out for that next time. But yeah, I don't like it when teachers fucking chew you out in front of like the whole class. That shit's not fun. Okay, yeah. At the end of each of her classes, she introduced me to the teacher. One of them said to me, "You live in the same Okia as Pumpkin, do you?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. The Nita Okia. For Nita was the family name of Granny and Mother, as well as Auntie. That means you live with Hatsumomo-san." "Yes, ma'am. Hatsumomo is the only geisha in our Okia at present." "I'll do my best to teach you about singing," she said, "so long as you manage to stay alive." Yeah, so long as you manage to stay alive. After this, the teacher laughed as though she'd made a great joke and sent us on our way. And that is the end of that chapter. Okay, I'm going to do one more chapter because the chapter after that chapter is, I feel, hella long. This one's not as hella long. And it leaves me to the perfect cutoff point because it'll probably take around like 10:30 to finish it, which is what I wanted. Okay, so hold on, let me. Okay. Chapter 5. That afternoon, Hatsumomo took me to the Gion registry office. Hold on. I need to put some more chapstick. Because my lips are getting chapped. Man, my jaw hurts now. Well, it doesn't hurt, but it's like, it's starting to get sore. Yeah. Chapter 5. That afternoon, Hatsumomo took me to the Gion registry office. I wasn't expecting something very grand, but it turned out to be nothing. Oh no, I was expecting something very grand, but it turned out to be nothing more than several dark tatami rooms in the second floor of the school building, filled with desks and accounting books and smelling terribly of cigarettes. A clerk looked up at us through the haze of smoke and nodded us back into the room. There was a table piled with papers. There at the table, piled with papers, sat the biggest man I'd ever seen in my life. I didn't know it at the time, but he'd once been a sumo wrestler. And really, if he'd gone outside and slammed his weight into the building itself, all those desks would probably have fallen off the tatami. All of those desks would probably have fallen off the tatami platform onto the floor. He hadn't been a good enough sumo wrestler to take a retirement name, as some of them do. But he still liked to be called by the name he used in his wrestling days, which was Awajiumi. Some of the geisha shortened this playfully to Awaji, as a nickname. As soon as we walked in, Hatsumomo turned on her charm. It was the first time I'd ever spoke. It was the first time I'd ever seen her do it. She said to him, "Awaji-san." Yeah, Awaji-san. But the way she spoke, I wouldn't have been surprised if she had run out of breath in the middle, because it sounded like this. "Awaji-san." It was as if she were scolding him. He put down his pen when he heard her voice, and his two big cheeks shifted up toward his ears, and which was his way of smiling. Hatsumomo-san, he said. "If you get any prettier, I don't know what I'm going to do." It sounded like a loud whisper when he spoke, because sumo wrestlers often ruin their voice boxes, smashing into one another's throats the way they do. He may have been the size of a hippopotamus, but Awashiyumi was a very elegant dresser. He wore a pin-striped kimono and kimono trousers. His job was to make certain that all the money passing through Gion flowed where it was supposed to, and a trickle from that river of cash flowed directly into his pocket. That isn't to say that he was stealing. It was just the way the system worked. Considering that Awajiomi had such an important job, it was to every geisha's advantage to keep him happy, which is why he had a reputation for spending as much time out on which is why he had a reputation for spending as much time out of his elegant clothes as in them. She and Washiyumi talked for a long time, and finally Hatsumomo told him she'd come to register me for lessons at the school. Awashiyumi hadn't really looked at me yet, but there he turned his giant head. After a moment, he got up to slide open... where was I? Yeah, after a moment, he got up to slide open one of the paper screens over the window for more light. "Why, I thought my eyes had fooled me," he said. "You should have told me sooner what a pretty girl you brought with you. Your eyes, they're the color of a mirror." "A mirror?" "Yeah, a mirror?" Hatsumomo said. "A mirror has no color, Awashi-san." "Of course it does. It's a sparkly gray. When you look at a mirror, all you see is yourself. But I know a pretty color when I find it." "Do you? Well, it isn't so pretty to me. I once saw a dead man fished out of the river, and his tongue was just the same color as her eyes." "Maybe you're just too pretty yourself to be able to see it elsewhere," Awajiyumi said, opening an account book and picking up his pen. "Anyway, let's register the girl. Now, Chio, is it? Tell me your full name, Chio, and your place of birth." The moment I heard these words, I had an image in my mind of Satsu staring up at Awajiyumi, full of confusion and fear. She must have been in the same room at some time or other. If I had to register, surely she'd had to too. "Sakamoto is my last name," I said. "I was born in the town of Yoroido. You may have heard of it, sir, because of my older sister Satsu." I thought Hatsumomo would be furious with me, but to my surprise, she almost seemed pleased about the question I'd asked. If she's older than you, she'd have registered already," Awajiyumi said. "But I haven't come across her. I don't think she's in Gion at all. Now Hatsumomo's smile made sense to me. She'd known in advance what Wajiumi would say. If I'd felt any doubts, yeah, if I'd felt any doubts whether she had really spoken to my sister as she claimed, I felt them no longer. There were other geisha, there were other, yeah, there were other geisha districts in Kyoto, though I didn't know much about them. Sensu was somewhere in one of them, and I was determined to find her. When I returned to the Okia, Auntie was waiting to take me to the back house down the street. I'd been there before, though only with the elderly maids. Excuse me. Uh, yeah. Yeah, I've been there before, though only with the elderly maids, who usually handed me a small towel and a scrap of soap, and then squatted on the tile floor to wash themselves while I did the same. Auntie was much kinder, and knelt over me to scrub my back. I was surprised that she had no modesty whatsoever, and slung her tube-shaped breasts around as if they were nothing more than bottles. She even whacked me on the shoulder with one several times by accident. Afterward, she took me to the Okia and dressed me in the first silk kimono I'd ever worn, a brilliant blue with green grasses all around the hem, and bright yellow flowers across the sleeves and chest. Then she led me up the stairs to Hatsumomo's room. Before going in, she gave me a stern warning not to distract Hatsumomo in any way or do anything that might make her angry. I didn't understand it at the time, but now I know perfectly well why she was so concerned. Because, you see, when a geisha wakes up in the morning, she is just like any other woman. Her face may be greasy from sleep, and her breath unpleasant, but, uh, yeah, her face may be greasy from sleep, or her breath unpleasant. It may be true that she wears a startling hairstyle even as she struggles to open her eyes, but in every other respect, she's a woman like any other, and not a geisha at all. Only when she sits before her mirror to apply her makeup with care does she become a geisha. And I don't mean that this is when she begins to look like one. This is when she begins to think like one too. In the room, I was instructed to sit about an arm's length to the side of Hatsumomo, and just behind her, where I could see her face in the tiny dressing room mirror on her makeup stand. She was kneeling on a cushion, wearing a cotton robe that clung to her shoulders, and gathering. Yeah, she was kneeling on a cushion, wearing a cotton robe that clung to her shoulders, and gathering in her hands a half-dozen makeup brushes in various shapes. Some were broad like fans, while others looked like a chopstick with a dot of soft hair at the end. Finally, she turned and showed them to me. "These are my brushes," she said. "And do you remember this?" She took from the drawer of her makeup stand a glass container of stark white makeup and waved it around in the air for me to see. "This is the makeup I told you never to touch." "I haven't touched it," I said. She sniffed the closed jar several times and said, "No, I don't think you have." Then she put the makeup down and put up 3 pigment sticks. And took up 3 pigment sticks, which she held out for me in the palm of her hand. "These are for shading. You may look at them." I took one of the pigment sticks from her. It was about the size of a baby's finger. but hard and smooth as stone. That's when it left no. Uh, hold on. Yeah, I took one of the pigment sticks from her. It was about the size of a baby's finger, but hard and smooth as stone, so that it left no trace of color on my skin. One end was wrapped in delicate silver foil that was flecking away from the pressure of use. Hatsumomo took the pigment sticks back and held what looked to me like a twig of wood burned at one egg. Like a twig of wood burned at one end. At one end. Hold on, there's a word that's coming up and I don't know how to pronounce it. Okay. Yeah, Hatsumomo took the pigment sticks back and held out what looked to me like a twig of wood burned at one end. This is a nice This is a nice dry piece of paulownia wood, she said, for drawing my eyebrows. And this is wax. She took she took two half-used bars of wax from their paper wrappings and held them out for me to see. Now, why do you suppose I've shown these things? Yeah. Now, why do you suppose I've shown you these things? So I'll understand how you put on your makeup? Yes. So I'll understand how you put on your makeup, I said. Heavens no. I've shown them to you so you'll see there isn't any magic involved. What a pity for you. Because it means that makeup alone won't be enough to change poor Chio into something beautiful. Hatsumomo turned back to face the mirror and sang quietly to herself as she opened a jar of pale yellow cream. You may not believe me when I tell you that this cream was made from nightingale droppings, but it's true. Many geisha used it as a face cream in those days because it was believed to be very good for the skin, but it was so expensive that Hatsumomo only put a few drops around her eyes and mouth. Then she tore a small piece of wax from one of the bars and after softening it in in her fingertips, rubbed it into the skin of her face, and afterward of her neck and chest. She took some time to wipe her hands clean on a rag, and then moistened one of her flat makeup brushes in a deep dish of water, and brushed it in the makeup until she had a chalky white paste. She used this to paint her face and neck, but left her eyes bare. But left her eyes bare, as well as the area around her lips and nose. If you've ever seen a child cut holes in paper to make a mask, this was how Hatsumomo looked, until she dampened some smaller brushes and used them to fill in the cutouts. After this, she looked as if she'd fallen. After this, she looked like she'd fallen face first into a bin of rice flour, for her whole face was ghastly white. She looked like the demon she was. But even so, I was sick with jealousy and shame, because I knew that in an hour or so, men would be gazing with astonishment at that face, and I would still be here in the okia, looking sweaty and plain. Now she moistened her pigment sticks and used them Yeah, now she moistened her pigment sticks and used them to make a reddish blue. Hold on. Yeah, now she moistened her pigment sticks and used them to rub blush, a reddish blush onto her cheeks. Already during my first month in the Okia, I'd seen Hatsumomo in her finished makeup many times. I stole looks at her whenever I could without seeming rude. I'd noticed she'd used a variety of tints for her cheeks, depending on the colors of her kimono. There was nothing unusual in this, but what I didn't know until years later was that Hatsumomo always chose a shade much redder than others might have used. I can't say why she did this, unless it was to make people think of blood, but Hatsumomo was no fool. She knew how to bring out the beauty in her features. When she'd finished applying blush, she still had no eyebrows or lips. But for the moment she left her face like a bizarre white mask and asked Auntie to paint the back of her neck. Okay, hold on. Yeah, but for the moment she left her face like a bizarre white mask and asked Auntie to paint the back of her neck. I must tell you something about necks in Japan. If you don't know it, namely that Japanese men, as a rule, feel about a woman's neck and throat the same way that men in the West might feel about a woman's legs. This is why geisha wear the collars of their kimono so low in the back that the first few bumps of the spine are visible. I suppose it's like a woman in Paris wearing a short skirt. Auntie painted Auntie painted one of the back of Hatsumomo's neck. Yeah, the Auntie painted onto the back of Hatsumomo's neck a design called Sanbon Ashi, 3 legs. It makes a very dramatic picture, for you feel as if you're looking at the bare skin of the neck through little tapering points of a white fence. It was years before I understood the erotic effect it has on men, but in a way, it's like a woman. A woman peering out from between her fingers. In fact, the geisha In fact, a geisha leaves a tiny margin of skin bare all around the hairline, causing her makeup to look even more artificial. Sometimes like a mask worn in no drama. When a man sits beside her and sees her makeup like a mask, he becomes that much more aware of the bare skin beneath. While Hatsumomo was rinsing out her brushes, she glanced several times at my reflection in the mirror. Finally, she said to me, "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking you'll never be so beautiful. Well, it's perfectly true. I'll have you know," said Auntie, "that some people find Shio-chan quite a lovely girl. Some people like the smell of rotting fish," said Hatsumomo. And with that, she ordered us to leave the room so she could change into her underrobe. Auntie and I stepped out into the landing, where Mr. Beku stood waiting near the full-length mirror, looking just as he had on the day he'd taken Satsu and me from our home. As I'd learned during my first week in Okia, his real occupation wasn't dragging girls from their homes at all. He was a dresser, which is to say that he came to the Okia every day to help Hatsumomo put on her elaborate kimono. The robe Hatsumomo would wear that evening was hanging on the stand near the min, the ro- eh. The robe Hatsumomo would wear that evening was hanging on a stand near the mirror. Hanti stood smoothing it until Hatsumomo came out wearing an underrobe in a lovely rust color with a pattern of deep yellow leaves. What happened next made very little sense to me at the time, but because the complicated costume of kimono is confusing to people who aren't accustomed to it. But the way it's worn makes perfect sense if explained properly. To begin with, you must have to begin with, you must understand that a housewife and a geisha wear kimono very differently. When a housewife dresses in kimono, she uses all sorts of padding to keep the robe from bunching unattractively at the waist. Excuse me, sorry, I have to burp. Okay. To begin with, you must understand that a housewife and a geisha wear kimono very differently. When a housewife wear when a housewife dresses in kimono, she uses all sorts of padding to keep the robe from bunching unattractively at the waist, with the result that she ends up looking perfectly cylindrical, like a wood column at a temple hall. But a geisha wears kimonos so frequently she hardly needs any padding, and bunching never seems to be a problem. Both a housewife and a geisha will begin by taking off their makeup robes and tucking a silk slip around the bare hips. We call this koshimaki, hip wrap. It's followed by a short-sleeved kimono undershirt, tied shut at the waist, and then the pads, which look like small contoured pillows with strings affixed for tying them into place. In Hatsumomo's case, with her traditional small-hipped, willowy figure and her experience of wearing kimono so many years, she didn't use padding at all. So far, everything the woman has put on will be hidden from the eye when she is fully dressed. But the next item, the underrobe, isn't really an undergarment at all. When a geisha performs a dance, or sometimes even when she walks along the street, she might raise the hem of her kimono in her left hand to keep it out of the way. This has the same effect of this has the effect of exposing the underrobe under the knees. Yeah, below the knees. Yeah, this has the effect of exposing the underrobe below the knees. So you see, the pattern and fabric of the underrobe must be coordinated with the kimono. And in fact, the underrobe's collar uh, shows as well, just like the collar of a man's shirt when he wears a business suit. Part of Auntie's job in the Okia was to sew a silk collar each day on the underrobe. Yeah, part of Auntie's job in Okia was to sew a silk collar each day onto the underrobe Hatsumomo planned to wear, then remove it the next morning for cleaning. An apprentice geisha wears a red collar, but of course Hatsumomo wasn't an apprentice. Yeah, but of course Hatsumomo wasn't an apprentice. Her collar was white. When Hatsumomo came out of her room, she was wearing all items. Yeah, when Hatsumomo came out of her room, she was wearing all the items I've described, though we could see nothing but her underrobe. Yeah, though we could see nothing but her underrobe, held shut with a cord around her waist. Also, she wore white socks we called tabi, which button along the side in a snug fit. At this point, she was ready. At this point, she was ready for Mr. Becky to dress her. Uh, to see him at work, you'd to see him at work, you'd have understood at once why his help was necessary. Kimono are the same length no matter who wears them, except for the very tallest woman. The extra fabric must be folded underneath the sash. Kimono are the same length no matter who wears them. So, except for the tallest woman, the extra fabric must be folded underneath the sash. When Mr. Baku, doubled the kimono fabric at the waist and tied a cord to hold it in place, there was never the slightest buckle. Or, if no one did appear, eh. Yeah, when Mr. Bickle, eh. Yeah, when Mr. Beku doubled the kimono fabric at the waist and tied a cord to hold it in place, there was never the slightest buckle. Or if one did appear, he gave a tug here or there, and the whole thing straightened out. When he finished his work, the robe always fit the contours of the body beautifully. Mr. Beku's principal job as the dresser was to tie the obi, which wasn't as simple a job as it might sound. An obi, like the one Hatsumomo wear, is twice as long as a man is tall, and nearly as wide as a woman's shoulders. Wrapped around the waist, it covers the area of the breastbone all the way down to the navel. Most people who know nothing of kimono seem to think the obi is simply tied in the back as if it were a string, but nothing could be farther from the truth. A half dozen cords and clamps are needed to keep it in place, and a certain amount of padding must be used as well to shape the knot. Mr. Beku took several minutes to tie Hatsumomo's obi. When he was done, hardly a wrinkle could be seen anywhere in the fabric, thick and heavy as it was. I understood very little of what I saw on the landing that day, but it seemed to me that Mr. Beku tied strings and tucked fabric at a frantic rate, while Hatsumomo did nothing more than hold her arms out and gaze at her image in the mirror. I felt miserable with envy watching her. Her kimono was a brocade of shade. Yeah, her kimono was a brocade of shades in brown and gold. Below the waist, deer in their rich brown coloring of autumn nuzzled one another, and golds and rests behind them in a pattern like fallen leaves on a forest floor. Her obi was plum-colored interwoven. Her obi was plum-colored, interwoven with silver threads. I didn't know it at the time, but the outfit she wore probably cost as much as a policeman or a shoemaker might make in an entire year. And yet, to look at Hatsumomo standing there, when she turned around to glance back at herself in the freestanding mirror, you would have thought that no amount of money on earth could have made a woman look as glamorous as she did. All that remained were the final touches on her makeup and the ornaments in her hair. Auntie and I followed Hatsumomo back into her room, where she knelt as Auntie and I followed Hatsumomo back into her room, where she knelt at her dressing table and took out a tiny lacquer box containing rouge for her lips. She used a small brush to paint it on. The fashion at the time was to leave the upper lip unpainted, but she used a small brush to paint it on. The fashion at the time was to leave the upper lip unpainted, which made the lower lip look fuller. White makeup causes all sorts of curious illusions. If a geisha wears Yeah, if a geisha were to paint the entire surface of her lips, her mouth would end up looking like two big slices of tuna. So most geisha prefer a poutier shape, more like a bloom of a violet. Unless a geisha has lips of this shape to begin with, and very few do. She nearly always paints them a more circle-shaped mouth than she actually has. But as I've said, the fashion in those days was to paint only the lower lip, and that is what Hatsumomo did. Now Hatsumomo took the twig of paulownia wood she'd shown me earlier and lit it with a match. After it burned for a few seconds, she blew it out, cooled it with her fingertips, and then went back to the mirror to draw in her eyebrows with the charcoal. It made a lovely shade of soft gray. Next, she went to a closet and selected a few ornaments for her hair, including one of tortoise shell and an unusual cluster of pearls at the end of a long pin. When she slipped them into her hair, she applied a Sorry, I thought I heard something. Yeah, when she went into next, she went into eh. Next, she went to a closet and selected a few ornaments for her hair, including one of tortoise shell and an unusual cluster of pearls at the end of a long pin. When she slipped them into her hair, she applied a bit of perfume to the bare flesh on the back of her neck, and tucked the flat wooden vial into her obi afterward in case she should need it again. She also put a folding fan into her obi and placed a kerchief in her right sleeve. And with this, she turned around to. And with this, she looked. Eh, and with this, she turned down. Oh my god. Okay, let me say this again. Yeah. Uh, uh, uh. Yeah, she also put her folding fan into her obi and placed a kerchief in her right sleeve. And with this, she turned to look down at me. She wore the faint smile she had worn earlier, and even Auntie had to sigh from how extraordinary Hatsumomo looked. And that, oh god, that is the end of that chapter. Okay. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you in the next